Minority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of Law at the University of San Francisco, author of A Place Outside the Law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo, Professor Peter Jan Honigsberg. Welcome to the program.
My pleasure, Sam. Thank you. And let me be another person to wish you Happy New Year.
Oh, well, thank you. And Happy New Year's to you as well.
Thank you.
Now, we are now, I guess, 2 days out from what was, if I'm not mistaken, the 17th anniversary of, I guess, the formal opening of the detention center in Guantanamo Bay.
Actually, the 18th. It was 18th. In 2002.
Okay, so that was basically 4 months after, or just not even 4 months, just a couple of months after we.
4 months after 9/11, September 11th to January 11th.
All right, and at its peak, and I'll get into the details, but I just want to put just some of the numbers down first. At its peak, there were 780 people, or
that's correct. Over the almost 2 decades, there were 780 people.
And there are 40, as far as I know, remaining.
40 people remain.
6 of whom who will be tried, and then the other 34 are basically in prison for life without ever being tried.
Well, actually, 2 there convicted. 1 was sentenced. The other is waiting to be sentenced. So there are 2 others there. But there are 26 people who are called forever prisoners. There's not enough evidence to try them and convict them because the evidence they obtained on these men were through torture. But the government somehow feels that these men are dangerous and they can't release them. So basically, they're there without charges and they'll never be prosecuted, no convictions, and they'll probably die there never having been charged, which is unheard of. No country in the world has ever held people for that long without charges. Then there are 5 other men there who were actually could have been released by President Obama, but for various reasons weren't released in time. And they're there now, and Trump, of course, won't release them. So maybe if there were a Democratic president, he or she might release them. But at this point, they're there as well. Okay.
Will you just outline, I want to, before we talk about how people got to Guantanamo, will you just outline for us, why Guantanamo was chosen? This is about a 40 square mile patch of land in Cuba. It is not Cuban per se. It is basically our little outpost in Cuba. Will you just explain that to people? Because I don't think that people are fully aware of this dynamic, and then talk about why it was chosen, which is in part a function of it being such an odd piece of land.
Actually, at the turn of the last century, the U.S. took control of that 40-mile stretch from Cuba, and they contracted with Cuba where they would pay Cuba $2,000 a year in gold for the lease. And then Cuba tried to get out of the lease, but the lease said that either country can maintain the lease. Both countries have to agree to cancel it. And of course, the U.S. won't. And Cuba won't accept the money anymore, but the U.S. keeps paying them. And the U.S. just keeps the land. And Cuba, of course, cannot go in and attack the U.S. to take it back. So the U.S. just controls that land. And they have for more than a century. And after 9/11, the government was looking for a place where they could house the captives. And they wanted a place that, as the reason why my book is called A Place Outside the Law, they wanted a place that was, quote, outside the law, where they felt the federal courts could never intervene in that. They could do whatever they wanted to these men, and no one would be able to stop that. And so they actually looked at places all over the world, including putting men on ships, and there were just too many men to put on ships, and putting them into other bases around the world. But they decided that there were a lot of advantages in going to Guantanamo, one of which was close to the U.S. mainland so that officials and military officials could fly down there when necessary. and also because they believe since it was caught on Cuban soil, and there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision from the 1940s that seemed to indicate that these men might not have any recourse and not have the right to go to federal court to challenge their detentions. That was wrong, but at that point, that's what the federal government officials thought, and that's why they chose Guantanamo.
So they were because there was this sense that the U.S. government had that this is neither fish nor fowl. We're in basically, I guess, international waters, as it were, even though that we're essentially we claim authority over it. Nobody, if you're on a boat in international authority, I mean, I guess. I mean, I don't even understand how the legal logic could have worked. I mean, it's under U.S. control, but when did the Supreme Court ultimately decide that, yeah, that theory, sorry, that's not going to work?
Well, actually, they first decided in 2004, and I can tell you a cute story behind that. And the U.S. government kind of challenged it. The Supreme Court said that the detainees had the right to challenge their detentions in federal court under what they call statutory habeas. And the federal government said, we're going to change the law there and consequently still keep the men from challenging their detentions. And so the lawyers on behalf of the detainees went back to court, and then in 2008 they came up with a constitutional decision which said that the men had an absolute right under the U.S. Constitution to challenge their detentions in court. And that was pretty remarkable. The government never should have let them get to the Constitution, because that has changed the law. It can't be returned. So that's what happened. But initially, there was a 2004, a very early decision, given that the war began in 2001, for the Supreme Court to step in a war and decide that the men had the right to challenge the detentions. But they did. And I'll tell you this cute story, Sam. And no one expects the Supreme Court to take the case. And one of the lawyers who appealed to the Supreme Court to take the case, a man named Tom Wilner, lives in Washington, D.C., wrote in his brief to the court, asking them to take the case, that when the Cuban iguana is in Cuba, it is a delicacy and can be eaten. But if the Cuban iguana happens to crawl under the fence and come into Guantanamo Naval Base, it is protected by the Endangered Species Act. And so Wilner argued that the Cuban iguana had more rights than the men in Guantanamo. And of course, the Supreme Court never touched that on paper, but we often wonder whether that had some impact on them.
Oh, that's fascinating. And what was the, and I want to get to, some of the people you talked to and sort of like the basis of the book in just a moment, but what were the implications for the prisoners in Guantanamo of that legal decision? Like, how did their destinies or their fates in that or their trajectories change because of those legal rulings?
Well, unfortunately, after the first legal ruling, not much changed, except that they had now a right to a lawyer. Before then, lawyers were not allowed to go down to the base to represent them. And so they were completely at the mercy of the U.S. government. Once that decision came out, it entitled them to an attorney. At least once attorneys came down there, they had a little bit more protection in a sense. The attorneys could observe what was going on. And so a lot of the torture, much of which was psychological, seemed to become much more limited after that first 2004 decision. But because the U.S. government did a lot of machinations, which are too complicated for me to go with you over the phone, there wasn't a whole lot of success on challenging detentions subsequently from 2004. It wasn't, it wasn't until 2008 with a later constitutional decision that it made a difference. I will tell you a couple of things along those lines, Sam, since you asked. A lot of lawyers believe, and it seems to be true, that essentially lawyers didn't help the detainees as much as they would have liked to, that in fact people who were released from Guantanamo were pretty much released because the administration decided it was time to release them. The courts tended to go with the government, and so if the government challenged any of the claims of the detainees that they should be released, usually the court's afraid to, quote, release a terrorist, tended to side with the U.S. government, and the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals is very conservative, sided with the U.S. government on every decision. Consequently, these men were not released by the courts. They were released because the U.S. government decided it was time to release them. And there were lots of political reasons why they released them when they did. Sometimes they released them because they were members of a country or citizens of a country that President Bush wanted to have join his allegiance against Iraq, and he just wanted them to be on their side, so he'd release them as a favor to the country. So a lot of it was political, and unfortunately the lawyers got very frustrated because they did a phenomenal job. They worked really hard. They were very passionate. But at the end of the day, the courts tended to side with the U.S. government for fear that, quote, they would be releasing a terrorist, and they didn't want that on their hands. I will add something else, Sam, just so people have a context. The 780 people in Guantanamo, a large number of them, can't say, but it's likely a majority even, were purchased by the U.S. government. They weren't, quote, captured. What happened was the U.S. government dropped flyers over Afghanistan after 9/11, and the flyers said that if you bring us Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters, we'll pay you. And they paid $3,000 to $5,000 a person. So essentially, anybody who was a stranger or even a tribal enemy was worth a lot of money to anybody on the ground who could grab them. And so we purchased everybody who they brought to us. And so a lot of the people in Guantanamo were just people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and people made a lot of money selling them to us.
Do we know how many of those people exist? And I should say, like, what was there any vetting process? So, I'm at a military command in Kabul, or I'm at Bagram Air Base, and people show up at the front gate. Here, we've got this guy. We tied him up. He's Al-Qaeda. Okay, here's your $3,000. Was there any vetting process? And then what happened to a lot of those people? Because a lot of this torture began in Afghanistan.
That's correct. Most of the physical torture that the Guantanamo detainees suffered was most severe in Afghanistan, and there was not a whole lot of vetting. They pretty much thought that whoever they had could be a potential terrorist or was a terrorist. They didn't really vet them all that much. Most of them were just put in these big tents and held there, tied up and tortured, and then ultimately put on a plane and sent to Guantanamo. If they actually captured someone who was a threat, they sent them to what they call a black site, a CIA-run black site around the world, about 125. There was no official number, but approximately that number of people were sent to places around the world and severely tortured by the CIA or by proxies of the CIA. But the rest of the people were either in Afghanistan and then pretty much sent to Guantanamo. They figured they'd vet them in Guantanamo, which was not really all that happened. It's like I said, a lot of it was politics.
All right. And so your book is essentially an oral history. You have been working on this for at least a decade at this point.
Correct.
What was the impetus for this book?
That's a great question. What happened was back in 2008, when President Obama, or that time candidate Barack Obama, was running and John McCain was running for the Republican Party, both men said that they want to close Guantanamo. And actually, President George Bush also said he thought Guantanamo should be closed. So it seemed like in the air it was going to happen. And my concern, I had done, ever since 9/11, I had done work on terrorism post 9/11, and it seemed to me that, yes, they were probably going to, whoever became president was probably going to close it. And I was concerned that these stories of Guantanamo would fade away into the dustbin of history, if you will, and there was no narrative of Guantanamo. There's very little written about Guantanamo by that time, and no one had really told full-length stories and all histories about Guantanamo, and once that closed, it'd be over, I felt. And so I was, excuse me, as long as you asked, I was actually inspired by my father. You probably know of the Shoah Foundation, which Steven Spielberg started in the 1980s. He wanted to document the Holocaust, and there were Holocaust deniers at that time. And my father had not been in a concentration camp, but had barely escaped from Austria just in time. And he was one of the people interviewed by the Shoah Foundation. I happened to be present when they interviewed him on camera, film, and that inspired me. And I thought we should do that too. We should film these all histories of people, both the detainees who were there and Americans who were there as prison guards, interrogators, interpreters, military officials, government officials, people who saw it from both sides. And so I was very fortunate. There was someone who had a small foundation in San Francisco, Bay Area, who offered me some money to be able to go to 5 countries in the summer of 2009, interview 16 detainees, and that got the project started. And eventually, we interviewed 158 people, both detainees and others, over that decade, telling their stories on film. And no one else has done that in the world, of course. And we have over 300 hours of film that we donated to Duke University Human Rights Archive, and they're going to ultimately put most of it up on the internet.
Did you, at the time when you started, did you anticipate that 10 years later, that Guantanamo would still be open, that there would still be more than 24 prisoners, some of whom will die there?
Actually, it's funny you ask that. Even though I thought at first, well, maybe these men will close Guantanamo, I also don't trust what I hear, even from people who have good intentions. And I just felt that, I don't know. I don't know if that will happen. And someone even from the Obama administration, when he won, from the transition team, called me up and said, look, Peter, we're going to close Guantanamo, and we're going to hold hearings, and you don't have to do this. And I said, well, I would love to know that's true, but I'm going to start this just in case that's not true. And so I was still doing it 10 years later. And so it's not that I'm cynical, even skeptical, but I just know the way politics works. And a good example of that, Sam, is, a lot of people, when we told people what we're doing, a lot of people said, well, Guantanamo's closed. I said, it's not closed. Why do you think that? And it's because President Obama said 4 times he was closing Guantanamo, and people believed if he said it, he did it. But he never did. And honestly, I'm not sure we want to go into, but it wasn't just the Republicans blocking him, that reason why he never did. But beside that, he never did. And so even people with very good intentions don't always follow through. And I just felt we had to do this for history.
I do actually want to get into that, but let's first talk a little bit about some of the these people that you spoke to. Yes, and the thing that I was struck by was I have talked to advocates of abolishing the capital punishment, and one of the things that they talk about is you never hear the stories of and obviously they shouldn't be centered, right? I mean the victims are, but you never hear the stories of how the people who actually kill people, how it impacts them, the executioners, yeah. And there's a quality of your work here that I think sort of like brings that out as well. But let's start. I don't know if there's a detainee that sticks out in your mind that is most relevant. I'm curious about hearing about, and I may be pronouncing his name wrong, Murad
Benchalali.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he was French, and he was kind of naive. His brother actually had some connections to a terrorist organization and went to Afghanistan, and he encouraged Murad to follow him. Murad was a young man, and in fact, Sam, there were some number of, quote, juveniles in Guantanamo who were over 16. There were a few under 16 but most were between 16 and 18, and they were held there as adults. And Murad was, I think, 18 or 19, but he was naive, and he kind of followed his brother to Afghanistan and then was caught up like so many other strangers in Afghanistan and purchased and brought to Guantanamo. And he was miserable. One of the reasons why he caught my eye is because he was very depressed when we interviewed him the first time. We interviewed him a second time as well. And it was because he felt that what he saw at Guantanamo was much worse for him than a physical prison. It was a psychological prison. And I don't think people realize that. A lot of the torture and the physical beatings were done in Afghanistan, but when the men came to Guantanamo, they were more psychologically tortured. And to Murad and to most of the people we interviewed, detainees, that was worse. As one other French detainee said to us, once you pull out the knife, you start to heal, but with psychological torture, you never heal. And the UN Special Rapporteur for Torture told us that after 15 days in isolation, people usually never come back fully. And so these men were held in isolation sometimes for more than a year. And there were also other ways that they messed with these men in ways that Murad expressed, you just couldn't come back from it. There was something called frequent flyer, where they took these men and moved them to a cell and let them stay there for 2 to 3 hours, and came to them and said, time to move, and moved them again to another cell for 2 or 3 hours, and then came back and said, time to move again. They did that for 2 or 3 weeks, so the men never got any sleep, and they just were moved from cell to cell, and that was called frequent flying, and that was done as well. I can go into other ways of the psychological torture.
Please do.
They were told that they were going to go home, and they were dressed in street clothes, so they were going to put on a plane and go home. And then they were kept in another camp where they were told again and again they were going to go home, and then they never were go home. And then some days later or weeks later, they were taken and back to their cells and said, I guess you're not going home. And then another man was told once that his mother was on his way to Guantanamo and she was going to be raped and gang raped if he didn't start talking. And so it was in terms of how they mistreated these people. They took away what they called comfort items, where if you didn't behave, you didn't tell them what they want to hear, you were even denied toothbrushes or toilet paper, if you will, whatever it took to get them to be just more miserable and to feel defeated and to feel like there was no way out. In fact, some people said there was no way out. They thought the rules in the prison also changed day to day. The people who were in charge just made up rules as the day went on. And so the men never knew what to expect from moment to moment. And they also played with it another way. One Uyghur detainee, Uyghurs, you know about the Uyghurs now, they're the Muslims in China. One Uyghur told us that they came to pick up his meal and they asked for a spoon. And he said, you never gave me a spoon today. And they said, yes, we did. And he said, no, you didn't. So they brought in what they call the IRF force, which is a force of 6 guards that come in and mace the detainee and then beat him up and then carry him out and bring him to isolation. And he said they did that. They probably knew he didn't have a spoon, but they did that just to throw him off guard. They kind of want people not to be resistant, not to fight back. And so you never knew if you're going to be IRF'd or not. And this was another, even though it might be physical and sound physical to people, it was really more psychological because you never knew when you'd be IRF'd. It would just happen for reasons that were not rational.
Now, I know that you spoke to a whistleblower and that there was some military guards you spoke to. But was there anybody who you spoke to who, or have you learned subsequent through other means that how systemic this was? I mean, how when they start this like frequent flyer program, as they called it, or when they would put someone in isolation for that extended period of time. Or do any of these things? Were these people? Were the guards? Was the commanders whoever authorized this? I mean, how high up the chain did it go in terms of authorization, A, and B, how studied was this, or was this just sort of like something I learned when I was working at a jail, a private prison in Pennsylvania or something like that? I mean, where did these ideas come from?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question because obviously it had to come from above. I mean, prison guards are not going to take that kind of initiative on their own. Someone had to tell them to do that. And the question is how high up from above, whether Donald Rumsfeld did know about some of the tortures that were done in Guantanamo, whether he instructed these particular methods or whether people right below him did. Honestly, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I do think it was very diffuse, and I do think it was very clear that people had the option to do what they needed to do to get intel. What they were afraid of, what the government was very afraid of, is another 9/11 happening on their watch. And they wanted to and they weren't that concerned about these men other than if they had intel, they wanted it. And so on some level, the government officials, military officials, didn't really care what was done as long as they got the intel that would tell them if there was going to be another attack or not. So they pretty much let the interrogators off on their own. They let the prison guards on some level off on their own, basically in the hope that a detainee would, quote, break, although detainees didn't have much information, of course, because they weren't important. But their thinking was maybe they had something and they would break and tell it, and we would stop another 9/11.
Has there ever been a public claim by the United States that there's been information obtained from any of those Guantanamo detainees that has prevented a terrorist attack in this country?
I think President Bush said something like 600 attacks were prevented thanks to the intel that he obtained, or the government obtained through various sources, probably through black sites as well as through Guantanamo, but it was never documented, and no one ever believes that. I mean, if that was true, it certainly was. I haven't seen any documentation to say that.
Have you seen any documentation for one? I mean, I ask because, just this week, Donald Trump is up there saying that there, 4 embassies were about to be attacked imminent. There was an imminent attack on 4 embassies, and the media is being skeptical of this. But
Esper said that wasn't true. So
Esper said that he didn't have the information, but he believes it if the Trump believes it. But my point being that I was doing what I'm doing now during this era, and the credulity that was given George W. Bush in making these claims, and that Bush administration making these claims, is stunning. When the idea that we are now 10 years out from when he made that claim, more probably 12 years out when he made that claim, and there has not been one single iota shred of evidence to back that up, I think is pretty amazing. And I mean, that's why I say it, like the credulity that existed amongst the press, and just sort of like largely, he could say 600, cases, that we've stopped 600 terrorist attacks, and that's the end of it. Everybody just sort of says, okay. It's stunning. Tell us about Matt Diaz.
I will say one thing, and I'm not sure, I can't document this because I read it long ago, but I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was going to take some planes and possibly do some more explosions on planes, and I'm not exactly sure how that works, and I don't remember the timeline on that. There was something about that might or might not be true, but that's one of the only theories that I heard, and I'd have to look that up after we hang up, and you could look that up too. But
all right, fair enough. And so let's talk about Matt Diaz. He saw what was going wrong there very early. Who was he?
He was a lawyer who worked for the government right in Guantanamo, and his job was essentially to kind of cover for the Pentagon in Guantanamo. And one day he received he was copied on a letter that a human rights lawyer in New York City at the Center for Constitutional Rights sent to the Pentagon asking for the names of the detainees. And Diaz was copied on it, and the Pentagon said, sorry, it's classified, we can't reveal the names. And this really upset Matt because he felt that a lot of the loved ones of the detainees thought the detainees were dead. What happened was when we bombed Afghanistan, a lot of the men escaped to Pakistan or tried to escape to Pakistan and were captured. But some of them died in the bombings, of course, and a lot of families thought that their loved ones had died. And so they didn't even know their loved ones were alive, and yet their loved ones were alive in Guantanamo. And so Matt felt that if the U.S. government was never going to release the names, which is, by the way, it violates the Geneva Conventions, then these families would never know that their loved ones were there. And so Matt felt if the Pentagon wasn't doing it, maybe he should. And he knew that was a violation of law. He knew that if he was caught, he could easily go to prison. But I think he felt he needed to do the right thing. As he said to us, he was on the wrong side of things. And I think he felt that that these families would never know that their loved ones were in Guantanamo, and he felt they needed to know that. Which adds something I mentioned, the Geneva Conventions. President Bush said in February of 2002 that the Geneva Conventions do not apply to Guantanamo. The Supreme Court in 2006 said actually they do, but in the meantime they didn't apply when Matt Diaz did this, where he decided he was going to download the names of the detainees in Guantanamo, cut it up into small names, sheets of paper, and then put them into a greeting card and send that greeting card to a lawyer in New York. And the next morning Matt left the base, but a year later he got caught.
And was tried.
He served 6 months. He could have gotten 24 years, but apparently the military jury seemed to understand where he was coming from, and he only got 6 months in prison. He lost his license to practice law in Kansas, but actually last year in 2019 he got his license to practice law in New York City, and now he's a New York defense lawyer. So, he's back on his feet, and it took him a long time to get there.
Can you talk about the development of the term enemy combatant? This was one of the fun things of that first decade of the aughts. This sort of new category of people, essentially.
Sam, I really appreciate you. Must have read the book, or you read a large part of it. I'm very impressed. Thank you, because obviously you asked me really intelligent questions, and I appreciate it. Enemy combatant, from day one when I heard that term, I said, that's not a real term. That's a bogus term. There's no such thing. Under the Geneva Conventions, you're either lawful combatant or an unlawful combatant, say like a spy. But that is the universe of combatants, and there's no such thing as enemy combatant. That's just a generic term, and it means nothing. And yet the government kept using it, and they used that because they wanted to circumvent the Geneva Conventions, because they didn't want to get caught there, since Bush said the Geneva Conventions don't apply. So it drove me nuts, to tell you the truth, because I knew somebody had come up with that term, and it's not true, and I wanted to know who it was. And no matter how much research I did, I couldn't find it. And so when I started interviewing people in this project, I asked every military person I interviewed, I said, do you know where that term comes from? I didn't expect an answer, but I just thought, I need to find out, because for history, we need to know that it was fake. And finally, just by chance, a very, very smart man who worked for the Pentagon, who was very highly respected.
Oh, hello?
Hello?
I'm sorry, we lost you. You dropped out for a moment. Who was highly respected?
Very highly respected military official in the Pentagon named Bill Litzow. He's a Marine, but he worked in the Pentagon. He worked for both Obama and Bush. He was very bright, very wonderful person in that field. We interviewed him. He agreed to interview with us, and I asked him that question too. And he said, matter of fact, I came up with the term. And he told us how it happened. He said that he was prepping some U.S. officials for a TV newscast, and they said, we need a term, and we can't use unlawful combatant because that has connotations of the Geneva Convention. So they said to Bill Litzow, can you come up with another term? And he said, well, you could use enemy combatant if you want, but it doesn't really mean anything. And they said, okay, we're going to use it. And the administration grabbed it and ran with it, and that's how it got life and legs. And does from then on, they used it in every possible way.
And is that term now, is that recognized by the courts? In other words, when they try to make the case that, like, look, this guy's an enemy combatant, therefore none of the laws that we have apply because no one's ever referred to an enemy combatant before because, of course, they've just made that up. I mean, that category is, was minted specifically because it stood outside of the definitions that existed. Do courts recognize that as a legal classification now? I mean, because I remember they even said that about like Jose Padilla at the time.
They did. They said that about Jose.
And this is a guy who's in Chicago. And so
an American citizen.
Yeah. I mean, does any courts recognize that? I mean, if you were a lawyer from, the federal government, you came in and you said, so-and-so is an enemy combatant, would the judge say, I don't know what you're talking about there?
Well, I would hope that if government lawyers said that, there'd be a lawyer representing the person who's being accused of being an enemy combatant and explain to the court that, in fact, that term has no meaning, that under the conventions which do apply to U.S., we signed the conventions, as every other country in the world has. That is not a term. And in fact, Obama did acknowledge that, in fact, enemy combatant was not a term and tried to go back to the Geneva Conventions when he was president. But, just the other day, Sam, I heard somebody use that term again. It might have been for the Iranian general who was killed. And so, it seems like it's on everyone's mind still, but it's not a term. And I think if anybody does go to the court with that term, I'm hoping that the lawyer for the other side would say, in fact, it's not. It has no meaning.
There's a lot more I want to talk to you about as specific individuals. Lawyers from the Center for Constitutional Rights. Back in the day, I used to interview Michael Ratner quite a bit. There are others. There was one person who was literally, his nickname was King of the Torturers, who managed to be found not guilty when he was brought up in the court. But folks should check out your book. But before you go, I do want you to address the Obama administration's attempt to close Guantanamo and how much of that was a function. The argument that we heard from the Obama administration was that Congress basically stood in the way, that there was a fear-mongering sort of like, I guess, initiative, if you will, to try people in New York, that if we hold people in, New York federal prison, then New York becomes a target again. If I'm not mistaken, Chuck Schumer, and you can correct me on this, came out and said, we can't have that here, that type of thing. But there was a lot of that. But you tell me the story as you know it.
Well, that's a separate story, Sam. I mean, it's true that there was a lot of pushback when Obama tried to bring some of the prosecutions in New York. But in fact, the prosecutions, very, 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 very few people were prosecuted out of 780 people. Right. So those few prosecutions really have no bearing on closing the prison. They only have bearing on a few prosecutions. The actual closing of the prison is a different issue. And Obama said 4 different times during his 8 years in office that he wanted to close Guantanamo. And he claimed that the Republicans wouldn't let him. And that's because in each military appropriations bill, there was a clause that said that Guantanamo could not be closed. However, no one says, or very few people say, that Obama signed that bill every year. and he didn't have to sign it. Now, of course, he had to sign a bill to give funding to the military and the Pentagon, but he could easily have gone to Mitch McConnell and said, "Look, I'm not signing the bill until you take that provision out." And Obama didn't do that. He didn't go down and negotiate and deal with that for various reasons, which I can't tell you because I don't know. He didn't do it, and it happened year after year after year. He signed the bill that allowed the Republicans to forbid him from closing Guantanamo. So when he said that he wanted to close Guantanamo, I think he really did. I think he really did. But he also did not follow through where he could have.
Part of it was that they could not figure out a way to deal with the prisoners, right? I mean, like that the idea of housing them stateside and putting them was too onerous, I guess, in terms of like finding a suitable prison, and returning folks to their homes, to their home countries, was also off the table. Yes or no?
Well, he didn't have to go there because if he was forbidden from closing it, he didn't have to worry about what you just described. I mean, if in fact he had the option to close it where he wasn't restricted by the Congress, he could have then thought on what to do with these men. I mean, as we said, most of them were released anyways, only 40 left. So in fact, they weren't all that much of a threat. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been released. And Obama released a number, about 200 men as well. So the fact is, no, he, at some point he could have dealt with these last 40. The rest were out anyway. So he just, but he didn't give himself the option. By signing that bill every year, he didn't give himself the option to take the steps needed to close it. And he understood, and he even said it, Guantanamo was a stain on America. It was, a stain on America. People, I will tell you this, Sam, and, some of the detainees we interviewed said to us that before they were brought to Guantanamo, they loved the U.S. They thought the U.S. was the standard, the golden standard for human rights and the rule of law. They really believed that. And then they see the way we treated them. And Obama understood that. He totally understood that. And he could have said, I'm closing it down and figure out a way to deal with the last 40 people. It wasn't that hard. If they got rid of 740 people, there were only 40 left. But he never gave himself the option when he signed that bill every year. That's my feeling.
Well, the book is A Place Outside the Law: Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. It is it's a disturbing read, to be honest with you, but it's hugely important, and people need to have a better awareness of what we've been doing for 20 years. To folks, actually, I have one more question, if you'll indulge me. What do you think that Guantanamo has done to has it had an impact on our national psyche in some way? I mean, when we talk about, Martin Luther King said, when a bomb goes off in Vietnam and explodes in cities here in the United States, has what we've been doing in Guantanamo, whether it is how it's impacted our court system, or how it's impacted just our vocabulary, the idea of enemy combatant, this fake this sort of like extrajudicial or extra legal status, has it impacted what we are willing to accept in this country?
Sam, I'm not blowing smoke. I have to say, I really appreciate this conversation. You ask very intelligent questions. I really appreciate it. I don't always get that. I really do. But in answering it, I got to tell you two parts to it. The first part is that whenever we went overseas, everyone knew about Guantanamo. Everyone cared about Guantanamo. Everyone would ask us about Guantanamo. It really mattered to people in other countries all the time. It was shocking because then when I came back to America, like I said, I would tell people in America, they thought it was closed. They didn't want to think about it. They didn't want to hear about it. Essentially, it was such a stain on our national pride, people didn't want to know about it. It just was too painful. And it's funny what you said, my book is very disturbing. People always tell me that they're so glad I wrote the book. It's so important for history, but it's really, so sad And one woman said to me she gets so sad and so mad when she read it because it's against our nature. You know, we really believe in doing the right thing. I mean, we really care about doing the right thing. We do the right thing. And this is one of the darkest periods in American history where we didn't do the right thing. And people like to deny that, or at least not acknowledge it. They don't want to go there. It's just not what they want to see. They'd rather think it didn't happen, right? So these things are very disturbing, like you said, and therefore they'd rather think it was closed. They'd rather not address it. And unfortunately, until we do, we can't move on. I mean, really, I mean, some people think, you know, that was just the start of what allowed Trump to get away with what he's doing. Essentially, you know, we have to acknowledge when we do the wrong thing and come back to correcting it. We did that. Took us 60 years with putting the Japanese Americans, many of whom were citizens, in internment camps. And we need to acknowledge it with Guantanamo too. And I think when we do, we'll be a better country and a more unified country, and the country that we were, where we all believed in human rights and rule of law. No matter what side we were on, we all had the same values. And I think we need to go back there.
Peter Jan Honigsberg, the book is A Place Outside the Law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. We'll put a link at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Sam. It was an honor, a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.